Khaled Beydoun is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, and he currently serves as affiliated faculty with the UC Berkeley Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project. Khaled, you've just heard Eric and Jeff, and I wonder what you would say to the audience about whether you believe that the First Amendment should be construed to allow public and private universities from defining and banning hate speech.
Yeah, I echo Eric's position that universities and colleges aren't monolithic beings. Obviously, the culture at different universities and colleges is distinct and diverse along a range of lines. Obviously, legal character, obviously, religious character, geography has a big part to do with it. But I think for me, while I was listening to the conversation, theoretically, the idea that free speech should be protected, broadly speaking, appeals to me theoretically, but it's critical to kind of contextualize what's happening in this country right now with regard to that theoretical commitment. First of all, obviously, we see an emboldening of white supremacy, racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, essentially emboldened by the state, right? State policy, state rhetoric from the very highest office of the land. Second, I think that it's also critical, especially with regard to public universities, that currently there's this intersecting moment of the erosion of affirmative action, right? So the demographics at public universities specifically with regard to students of color is plummeting considerably. I taught at UCLA before my current institution, and the classes that I taught at, typically I was teaching critical race theory, and I had no black students. I had no Latinx students in my classes. So the idea that specifically at public institutions where students of color are far and few between, this commitment to a neutral principle of free speech, again, theoretically is really appealing and resonates with me, but it's unequal because the students of color at these universities typically can't burden the responsibility of, voicing, the collective interests of the communities they represent and so on. And on the other end, obviously, that because they're so far and few between, this emboldened violence coming from typically elements from the right make their vulnerability a lot more intense and a lot more pronounced at this converging kind of moment of, again, declining affirmative action. And where I come from, Michigan affirmative action has been abolished by referendums. Same situation in California. But also, again, this intensified animus that's been spurred by the state. So for me, again, it's important to contextualize what's going on sociopolitically in the current moment.
Thank you for that very important context. Khaled, on the University of Oklahoma.
Yeah, two points. The first point, I'd echo Eric that what value are these racist slurs adding to the intellectual vibrancy of the institution? Very little, right? In terms of value, we can protect the speech as speech generally speaking, but again, it's not enhancing, it's not enriching exchange on campus. Second, I think it raises another important point that we tend to kind of caricature hate as coming from the fringe right or the fringe left, right? But this fraternity, I think, illustrates that it also arises from, spaces and gradients along the political spectrum that aren't on the fringe right and the fringe left. And I wonder what kind of role that, these fringe actors on both sides of the extreme are actually activating, fraternities, other organizations on campus to partake in racist activity or, spew these racial slurs on campus that, might have some sort of process where they're inspiring or endangering student organizations on campus, especially in a place like Oklahoma, where I'm guessing, I haven't looked at the demographics, but the black student population might not be that significant.
Very much. So, Khaled, so much of your work is focused on anti-Islamic hate speech. Are Facebook and Google right to ban someone from saying "I hate Muslims"?
Yeah, I think rather than assessing whether they're right or wrong, I'd echo Keith's point that the objective, the move here on the part of Facebook and other social media platforms is responsive to this proliferation of, hateful chat groups, hateful Facebook pages, hateful microblogs and so on, which are exclusively committed to defaming religious groups, engaging in really low value depictions and discussions around, Muslims and other religious groups and so on. And there's an economic component, right? There'll be, in response to this proliferating presence of these hateful elements on these pages, what's happening is that, and obviously Facebook operates on a global scale in many Muslim majority countries, that many Muslims who are, seeing this when they're scrolling through Facebook are choosing to quit Facebook, right? And, go on to other spaces where the presence of these kind of hateful depictions and discussions are scarce or not as visible. So I think it's more economic, right? I think it's more economic that they want to maximize the number of users they have, coming onto their platforms on a daily basis, and less so making kind of a moral judgment as to whether it's the right or the wrong thing. I think that if you were to limit the scope of the conversation to what's happening here stateside, that I think that it's a good thing in the short term because of the current impasse we find ourselves at, obviously with, escalating private and state-sponsored Islamophobia. In the long term, hopefully that retrenches. And then I would rather that these private platforms not police this kind of speech. But I think that it's driven more by economic considerations on the part of Facebook and their competitors.
And this next question gets to that. One theory has been that speech can cause emotional injury. And therefore, rather than only being able to be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, that the notion of violence should be expanded to include emotional harm. And that's what this question gets at. It says there have been studies that have shown that hate speech can have negative effects on students' health and their academic performance. If you support no restrictions on speech, how do you reconcile these studies with the university's duty to educate its students and provide all students with an equal opportunity to learn? Khaled, I'll just phrase this question to you. Do you believe that universities should be able to ban speech that causes emotional injury and arguably denies an equal opportunity to learn?
Well, not categorically ban. And that question, harkens back or reminds me of an article written by Richard Delgado, Words That Wound, that theorized that specific forms of hate speech might spur emotional harm on the part of the targets of that hate speech. But it should be policed to an extent, right? So not categorically barred, but policed. In addition to tort claims tied to IED claims, intentional infliction of emotional distress claims, one thing that I think about is this tension between free speech, hate speech, and free exercise, right? So, for instance, if a campus has a robust presence of Islamophobes, for instance, right, that might have the effect on the part of Muslim students to not want to freely express their religious identity conspicuously for fear of backlash, right? So in addition to tort claims, there's also a detrimental effect on free exercise as well. And there's also a political dimension to that as well. So protecting the free speech of specific groups which partake in hateful language and activity might also silence the political views and organizing of other groups, right? We think about, for instance, BLM, which just designated by the FBI. Some elements of BLM were just designated as a black identity extremist groups. And then second, you have on campuses pro-Palestinian elements and organizations as well. So there's a range of tensions where speech can also give rise to tort claims. Speech can also diminish the free exercise rights of specific elements. And then obviously tension between specific kinds of speech and other forms of speech.